The wind in the high San Juans did not blow so much as it scoured. It was a living thing, a rasp of cold air that stripped the heat from a man's bones and left him feeling as brittle as the dead pine needles under his boots. Here, at 9,000 feet, the air was thin and sharp, tasting of granite dust and coming winter. It was late October, and the sky was already the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of snow that would seal the passes until spring. Jonah Blackwood adjusted the pack on his shoulders, the leather straps creaking against his buckskin jacket. He stopped at the ridgeline, his breath pluming white before him, and scanned the valley floor below. He was a man built of rawhide and patience, 35 years old but wearing a face that had seen 50 years of weather. His beard was dark and close-cropped, his eyes the gray of a storm cloud, constantly moving, constantly assessing. He lived his life between the silence of the high timber and the necessary noise of the trading posts, preferring the former. Towns were places of noise and complication, and Jonah had learned long ago that complication usually led to grief. He had buried a wife and a son 5 years ago, taken by a fever that swept through the settlement of Silverton like a scythe. Since then, he had found that the only conversation he could tolerate was the one he held with the land itself. The mountains did not lie. They did not make promises they could not keep. If you made a mistake here, the land killed you, but it did so honestly. He shifted his weight, looking down toward the twisting ribbon of Shadow Creek. Something was wrong. The stillness of the afternoon felt fractured. Jonah moved down the slope, his gait silent, placing his feet with the unconscious precision of a man who had spent his life stalking elk and avoiding Apache scouts. He reached the lower tree line and found the first sign. It was a snapped branch of scrub oak, hanging by a thread of bark. The break was fresh, the wood inside still white and damp. A deer would have brushed past it, a bear would have crushed it. This had been broken by a heavy passing, something that did not care about the noise it made. He crouched, brushing away a layer of fallen aspen leaves. Beneath them, pressed deep into the freezing mud, was the print of a horseshoe. It was a narrow shoe, shod with a heavy caulk for grip on rock. A rider. Jonah followed the track for 50 yards and found more. 3 horses, moving fast. They were riding hard, pushing the animals despite the treacherous ground. He found a discarded lantern wick, charred at the end, stomped into the dirt. It smelled of coal oil. Whoever these men were, they had been burning lights late into the morning, tracking something through the dark. He touched the charred cotton. It was still pliable. They were less than 2 hours ahead of him, or perhaps they had circled back. The direction of the tracks led toward the boundary of the Kestrel Ridge territory. Every man in the territory knew the name Kestrel Ridge. It was a mining claim that had grown into a kingdom, run by Harlan Kestrel. It was a place of high yields and low morals, where the law stopped at the property line and the company guards carried shotguns loaded with buckshot and salt. Jonah avoided it. He avoided the men who worked there, with their hollow eyes and aggressive laughter. He straightened, his hand instinctively brushing the stock of the Winchester rifle in his scabbard. The tracks were hunting tracks. The stride length of the horses showed they were in pursuit. But what were they hunting in this desolation? A wolf? A claim jumper? He moved parallel to the creek, keeping to the timber, his senses tuned to the frequency of the woods. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that did not belong. It was not the smell of horses or unwashed men. It was the smell of blood, faint and copper-sharp. Jonah quickened his pace. He dropped down into the creek bed, where the water rushed black and cold over smooth stones. The willows here were thick, a tangle of red branches that offered the only cover for miles. He saw the color first, a dull, lifeless gray wool, distinct against the red willow bark. He stopped, rifle raised, waiting for movement. There was none. He moved closer, the sound of the rushing water masking his approach. A figure lay collapsed in the mud, half in and half out of the freezing water. It was small, huddled into a ball, shaking with a violence that rattled the willow branches around it. Jonah lowered the rifle but did not sheath it. He stepped into the clearing. The figure gasped, a ragged, wet sound, and tried to scramble backward. It was a woman. She was soaked to the bone. Her dress, a rough thing made of gray wool, was torn at the shoulder and heavy with water. Her hair, dark and matted with pine needles and mud, hung over her face like a veil. She clawed at the muddy bank, dragging herself away from him, her fingers digging furrows in the earth. "Easy," Jonah said, his voice rough from disuse. He held up a hand, palm open. "I am not going to hurt you." The woman froze, her chest heaving. She turned her head, and Jonah felt a jolt go through him. She was young, perhaps no more than 22, but her face was gaunt, the skin pulled tight over high cheekbones. Her lips were blue with cold, but it was her eyes that stopped him. They were wide, dark, and filled with a terror so absolute it looked like madness. She looked at him not as a savior, but as an executioner. She tried to speak, but her jaw was locked tight from the cold. She pushed herself up on one arm, the other tucked protectively against her ribs. She looked at his rifle, then at his face, searching for the badge or the uniform that would seal her fate. "I am not with them," Jonah said, reading her fear. "I am a hunter, just a hunter." She stared at him, her breathing shallow and fast. She tried to pull her legs under her, to stand, to run, to do anything other than lie there in the mud under the gaze of a strange man. She managed to get one knee under her, but the effort cost her everything. She collapsed back down, a sob tearing from her throat. She looked up at him, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. Her voice was a whisper, brittle as ice. "My legs won't stop shaking," she said. The words hung in the cold air. It was not a plea for help. It was a confession of failure. She was angry at her own body for betraying her. Jonah slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped forward. The snow was beginning to fall now, large flakes that hissed as they hit the water. He knelt beside her. "Let me look," he said. She flinched as he reached out, squeezing her eyes shut as if expecting a blow. When his hand landed gently on her shoulder, she went rigid, holding her breath. Jonah ignored her fear for the moment. The cold was the immediate enemy. Hypothermia was setting in. If he did not get her warm soon, her heart would simply stop. He moved his hands down her legs. The wool of her skirt was frozen stiff, like a board. He needed to check for broken bones or deep lacerations. She had been dragging herself, which suggested an injury to the lower limbs. He lifted the hem of her sodden skirt, intending to check her ankles for frostbite. What he saw made him stop cold. The breath left his lungs in a rush. Riveted around her ankles were bands of iron. These were not the temporary handcuffs used by a sheriff to transport a prisoner. These were heavy, flat bands of iron, rusted and pitted, about 2 inches wide. They were secured not with a lock and key, but with hot-driven rivets. They had been hammered shut around her flesh. The metal had rubbed the skin raw. Angry red sores wept blood and clear fluid where the iron bit into the bone. The ankles were swollen, the flesh purple and bruised. Jonah stared at the markings stamped into the metal. Even through the rust, the letters were clear. K-R-M-C. Property. Kestrel Ridge Mining Company. Property. Jonah sat back on his heels, the horror of it hitting him like a physical blow to the stomach. He had seen men hanged. He had seen men scalped. He had seen the cruelty the world could inflict on the weak. But this was different. This was cold. This was industrial. This woman was not a criminal. She was livestock. He looked up at her face. She was watching him, shame burning in her eyes. She waited for him to show revulsion, or to recognize the mark of her ownership and haul her back to the camp. "You escaped," Jonah said. It was not a question. She nodded, a jerk of her head. "They are coming," she whispered. "The dogs. They have dogs." Jonah looked back the way he had come. The wind was picking up, howling through the pass. The snow was falling harder, a white curtain dropping over the world. If men were tracking her with dogs, the snow would help, but not for long. The scent would hold in the wet earth. He made a decision. It was a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation he had cultivated for 5 years. He was a man who walked away from trouble. He was a man who did not get involved. But he looked at the iron around her ankles, and he knew he could not leave her. He could not leave a dog in this condition, let alone a human being. He stood up and unclasped his heavy buffalo hide coat. He stripped it off and wrapped it around her, the warmth of his own body still trapped in the fur. "We have to move," he said. "My cabin is 3 miles up the ridge. It is hidden." She shook her head, panic rising again. "I cannot walk. I tried. The iron. It cuts." "I know," Jonah said. He crouched down, turning his back to her. "Put your arms around my neck." She hesitated. "Do it," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Or we both freeze here, or worse, they find us." She reached out, her hands trembling, and locked her fingers together at the base of his throat. Jonah reached back, grabbed her thighs, and stood up. She was light, terrifyingly light. She felt like a bird made of hollow bones, but the dead weight of the iron at her ankles threw off his balance. He adjusted his grip, gritting his teeth. He began to climb. The snow was blinding now. The world had reduced itself to a circle of white, 5 feet across. Jonah kept his head down, trusting his feet to find the path. He deliberately moved into the creek for 100 yards, the icy water numbing his feet but washing away his scent. It was a brutal slog, slipping on slime-covered rocks, the woman on his back dead weight. She did not speak. Occasionally, he felt a shudder run through her frame, a vibration against his spine. He wondered if she was crying or if the cold had finally taken hold of her nervous system. He climbed out of the creek where the granite turned to scree, forcing him to scramble on hands and knees for a moment before regaining his footing. He made sure to step only on rock, leaving no prints for a tracker to read. The wind screamed, tearing at his shirt. He was freezing without his coat, but he focused on the heat of the woman against his back. He focused on the anger that was beginning to burn in his gut. It was a slow, hot coal of rage. Who puts iron on a woman? What kind of man heats a rivet and hammers it shut around a girl's ankle? He knew the answer. Harlan Kestrel, and the men he paid to do his dirty work. Jonah's cabin was tucked into a fold of the mountain, beneath an overhang of gray stone that protected it from the worst of the avalanches. It was invisible until you were 10 feet from the door, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with moss and mud. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside. The air within was stale and cold, but it was dry. He carried her to the bunk in the corner, a frame filled with pine boughs and covered with elk hides. He lowered her gently. She did not let go of his neck immediately. For a second, she clung to him, a desperate, unconscious reflex of someone drowning. Then she released him and curled into a ball on the furs, shivering so hard her teeth clicked together with a sound like dry stones. Jonah moved efficiently. He latched the door and dropped the heavy wooden bar across it. He went to the cast-iron stove and opened the damper. He had laid a fire before he left, kindling and dry pine knots. He struck a match on the sole of his boot and touched it to the tinder. The fire caught with a roar, the draft sucking the smoke up the chimney. He filled a kettle from the water bucket and set it on the stove top. Then he turned back to the woman. She was watching him again. Her eyes were glassy now. "Fever." She muttered something, her head tossing on the rough pillow. "No," she whispered. "No more. I put it in the book. I worked Tuesday. She was delirious." Jonah approached the bed. He needed to get the wet clothes off her, but he knew how that would look to a terrified woman. "Miss," he said softly, "I need to warm you." She looked at him, but she did not see him. She saw someone else. "Please, Mr. Gentry," she mumbled. "The cost of the soap. I will pay it. Do not add it to the interest. Please." Jonah's jaw tightened. Debt penitence. He had heard whispers of it. It was a system as old as greed. You charge a worker for their food, their lodging, their tools. You charge them high interest. You make sure they can never earn enough to pay down the principal. And if they try to leave, you arrest them for theft of services. But to chain them, that was slavery by another name. He reached out and touched her forehead. It was burning hot, dry like parchment. He worked quickly, prioritizing survival over modesty. He cut the laces of her boots with his knife and peeled the sodden leather from her feet. Her feet were white and wrinkled from the wet, the toes waxy. He looked at the shackles again. In the light of the fire, they were even more grotesque. The skin beneath them was infected. He could smell the sickness in the wounds. "I'm sorry," he said to the unconscious room. He took a heavy wool blanket from his supply chest. He lifted her slightly and stripped the wet dress down. She whimpered, swatting at his hands weakly. "Stop," she moaned. "Stop it." "I am just helping," Jonah said, his voice a low rumble. "You are safe." He got the wet wool off her and immediately wrapped her in the dry blanket, tucking it tight around her shoulders and legs. He left her feet exposed to the warmth of the room, but not too close to the fire. Warming them too fast would cause agony. He pulled a stool over to the bed and sat down. The kettle began to sing. He poured hot water into a basin, adding a splash of whiskey from a bottle on the shelf to act as an antiseptic. He took a clean rag and soaked it in the steaming mixture. He lifted her left leg, supporting the calf with his hand. The metal cuff was heavy, dragging at the bruised skin. He squeezed the water from the rag and began to dab at the raw flesh around the rim of the iron. The woman hissed in her sleep, her body jerking. Jonah held her leg firm but gentle. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy now." He cleaned the blood and the grime. He saw old scars underneath the fresh wounds. She had been wearing these for a long time, months, maybe longer. The realization made his stomach turn. As he worked, he watched her face, beneath the dirt and the exhaustion. She had a strength to her. She had survived the camp. She had escaped. She had dragged herself through a freezing creek with iron on her legs. She opened her eyes suddenly. They were clear for a second, the fever receding. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the basin, the rag, his hand holding her shackled ankle with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his size. She pulled her leg back, a sharp, defensive motion. "You act like you care," she whispered, her voice rasping. "That is how it starts. That is how he started." She meant Kestrel, or perhaps the man she called Gentry. "I do not want anything from you," Jonah said, dipping the rag back into the water. "Everyone wants something," she said, and the bitterness in her voice was older than her years. "I want you to keep that leg," Jonah said evenly. "If the infection takes it, you die." She stared at him, trying to find the lie in his face. She found none. She let her head drop back onto the pillow, the energy draining out of her as quickly as it had come. "What is your name?" Jonah asked. "Eliza," she said. "Eliza May Hart. Rest, Eliza May Hart. You are safe here." "Safe," she repeated, the word tasting strange on her tongue. "Outside." The wind slammed against the cabin wall, a heavy thud that shook the timbers. The storm had arrived in full. The light from the single window was gone, replaced by a wall of white. Snow would be piling up against the door. The passes would be closed within the hour. They were trapped. Jonah looked at the door, then back to the woman. If the posse was still out there, they would be hunkering down too, or they would be dead. No man could ride in this. For tonight, the storm was their protector. It built a wall between them and the world, but it also locked them together in a space no bigger than 10 by 12 feet. Jonah finished cleaning her wounds and wrapped clean linen strips around the metal, padding the skin from the iron. He pulled the blanket down to cover her feet. He stood up and walked to the stove, adding another log. The fire popped and crackled, the only sound in the room besides the wind and Eliza's ragged breathing. He sat in his rocking chair, the Winchester across his lap. He would not sleep tonight. He would watch the door, and he would watch the woman. Eliza turned on her side, facing the wall. She was still shivering, but the violent shaking had stopped. "My legs," she mumbled into the darkness. Half asleep, they stopped shaking. Jonah watched the firelight dance on the iron rivets at her ankles, visible just beneath the hem of the blanket. Not yet, he thought. Not truly. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the flames. and settled in for the long night. The mountain had delivered him a trouble he hadn't asked for, but looking at the small shape beneath the blanket, he knew he wouldn't trade it back. He had spent 5 years learning how to be alone. It seemed the lesson was over. Eliza May Hart woke to the smell of wood smoke and frying bacon, a scent so domestic and forgotten that for a terrifying moment she thought she had died. The last thing she remembered was the biting cold of the creek water and the gray, swirling darkness of the snowstorm. She lay still, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was warm. That was the first impossibility. She was covered in heavy furs that smelled of pine and cured leather. She shifted her legs, and the reality of her life came rushing back with a dull, metallic clank of iron against iron. The sound seemed to fill the small room. She froze, her eyes darting around. She was in a cabin, low-roofed and sturdy. A cast-iron stove radiated heat in the corner. Standing before it, with his back to her, was the man from the creek. He was slicing something into a skillet, his movements economical and quiet. Eliza sat up slowly, clutching the furs to her chin. Her head throbbed, and her ankles burned with a dull, throbbing ache. But the sharp agony of the frostbite had receded into a tingling numbness. She looked down. The iron cuffs were still there, riveted permanently to her flesh. But someone, him, had wrapped soft strips of linen around the metal, cushioning the contact with her skin. She watched his broad back. He was a mountain of a man, dangerous in his stillness. In the camps, kindness was a prelude to extraction. If a guard gave you an extra blanket, he came back an hour later to collect the price. If the shift boss let you rest, it was because he wanted you fresh for something else in the dark. She calculated her debts. She was in his bed. She had eaten his food, or would soon. She was warm. The ledger in her mind, trained by 2 years of Harlan Kestrel's bookkeeping, tallied the cost. It would be high. Jonah turned. He held a tin plate in his hand. His face was unreadable, his gray eyes calm. "You are awake," he said. His voice was deep, like stones rolling in a riverbed. Eliza flinched, pulling her knees up, the chains rattling again. She hated the sound. It was the sound of cattle. It was the sound of a convict. "I'm hungry," she said, her voice cracking. Jonah stepped forward and set the plate on a rough wooden stool near the bunk. Bacon, beans, and a dense biscuit. "Eat!" Eliza looked at the food, her stomach twisting with a hunger so sharp it hurt. But she did not reach for it. She looked at Jonah, steeling herself. She let the furs drop from her shoulders, exposing the thin, stained chemise she wore beneath. It was torn at the neckline, revealing the hollow of her throat and the pale skin of her collarbone. She forced herself to meet his eyes. She tried to summon the look she had seen other women use, a look of invitation that was really just surrender. "I cannot pay you in coin," she whispered. "I have no money, but I know how this works." She reached for the hem of the blanket to cast it aside completely. If she offered it before he demanded it, perhaps he would be gentle. Perhaps he would be quick. That was the only bargaining power she had left, the illusion of consent. Jonah did not move toward her. He did not smile the way the guard smiled, with that wet, hungry look. Instead, his face darkened, a shadow passing over his features that looked like sorrow. "Cover yourself," he said. The command was sharp, and Eliza froze. She blinked, confused. Was he angry? Was she too dirty? Too thin? "I said cover yourself," Jonah repeated, softer this time. He turned his back on her, walking to the window where the morning light was filtering through cracks in the shutter. He picked up his rifle and began to wipe it down with a rag, his hands moving with rhythmic, soothing motions. "You are not a commodity here, Miss Hart," he said, speaking to the window. "I am not a merchant, and I do not trade in human flesh." Eliza sat there, the blanket pooled at her waist, her chest heaving. The rejection confused her more than a blow would have, a blow she understood, a blow fit into the world she knew. This dignity, this refusal to take what was helpless before him, unmoored her. But, "The food," she stammered, "the heat. You carried me." Jonah turned his head slightly, profiling his face against the gray light. You were dying. A man does not charge a toll for saving a life. Eat your breakfast. The storm has broken, and we have work to do." Eliza pulled the furs back up to her chin, her hands trembling. She looked at the plate of food. She took a piece of bacon and put it in her mouth. The salt and the fat hit her tongue, and tears sprang to her eyes instantly. She ate quickly, messily, while Jonah Blackwood stood guard over nothing but her modesty. By noon, the sun had broken through the clouds, turning the world into a blinding expanse of white. The storm had dropped 2 feet of snow, smoothing the rugged terrain into deceptive gentleness. Jonah went out to scout the ridge. He moved on snowshoes he had fashioned from ash wood and rawhide, moving silent and light over the drifts. He returned an hour later, bringing a blast of cold air with him into the cabin. He looked grim. "They are out there," he said, barring the door behind him. Eliza was sitting on the edge of the bunk, testing her weight on her feet. The pain was immediate, shooting up her shins, but she bit her lip and stood. "Who?" she asked. Jonah began to pack a canvas sack with supplies: dried meat, coffee, ammunition, 3 men, and a 4th who rides like he owns the mountain. They are skirting the lower valley, checking the creek line where I found you. They have a local deputy with them. I saw the star on his coat when the sun hit it." Eliza sank back down onto the bed, the chains clinking. "It is Deputy Hatcher," she said, her voice dull. "He is on Kestrel's payroll. He gets $5 for every runaway he brings back. 10 if we are uninjured enough to work the next day." Jonah stopped packing. He looked at the iron around her ankles. "Tell me," he said, "and tell me the truth. What is your crime? Men do not rivet iron on a woman for a simple debt." Eliza laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "My crime was believing a contract." She looked down at her hands, which were rough and scarred. "I came west 2 years ago. My father had died in Ohio, and there was nothing left but debts. I saw an advertisement, Kestrel Ridge Mining Company. They wanted cooks and laundresses. High wages, room and board included. It sounded like salvation." She looked up at Jonah. "When I got off the stagecoach, they had me sign a ledger. For the transport, they said. Then for the uniform. Then for the room. I worked 16 hours a day scrubbing the coal dust out of miners' clothes until my knuckles bled. At the end of the month, I went to collect my wages." She paused, the memory choking her. Harlan Kestrel was there, in his office. He wears fine suits, silk vests imported from San Francisco. He smells of bay rum and expensive tobacco. He smiled at me like a father. He opened the book and showed me that I owed him the cost of the soap. He said, the cost of the water, the cost of the coal to heat the water. My wages covered half of it. The rest was added to the principal. Jonah leaned against the table, his arms crossed. "Debt penitence," he murmured. "I tried to leave," Eliza said. "I told him I would walk away with nothing. He called the sheriff. He said I was stealing company property, the clothes on my back and the food in my belly. He said I had to work off the debt. They put me in the barracks. They put these—" She gestured to her ankles. "On the men who fought back. And then they put them on me when I tried to run the first time." She took a shuddering breath. "The debt never goes down. Jonah, it only grows. They charge you for the rental of the Shackles. They charge you for the gruel they feed you. It is a machine that eats people." Jonah's face was hard as granite. He looked at the Shackles with a new understanding. It was not just cruelty. It was a system. It was evil wrapped in the paper of law. "We cannot stay here," he said abruptly. "If they have Hatcher, they have the authority to search every cabin in the district. And they have dogs. The snow covers the scent for now. But if the wind shifts, they will find us." He walked over to the corner of the room where a pile of seasoned hickory staves sat curing. He selected one, testing its weight. He took his knife and quickly shaved the bark from the handle area, smoothing it until it fit a hand perfectly. He walked to the bunk and held it out to her. "Can you walk?" he asked. Eliza looked at the staff, then at her ankles. The iron weighed 5 pounds on each leg. Every step chafed. Every step was a reminder of what she was. "I have to," she said. Jonah nodded. "We are going to the mission at San Cristobal. It is 30 miles south, over the pass. There is a blacksmith there, a man named Thomas. He is a good man. He has tools that can cut cold iron." He knelt and checked the wrappings on her ankles one last time, tightening the linen. Then he stood and offered her his hand. She took it. His palm was rough, callus against callus, but his grip was steady. "We move slow," Jonah said. "We move quiet, and we do not stop until we are clear of the valley." They left the cabin as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the western peaks. The world was silent, muffled by the deep snow. Jonah led the way, breaking the trail with his snowshoes, creating a packed path for Eliza to follow. The walking was agony. The shackles were not designed for movement. They were designed for restriction. The chain that connected the two cuffs was only 18 inches long, forcing Eliza to take short, shuffling steps. She had to plant the staff, swing her weight, and drag her feet forward. Clink, drag, clink, drag. The sound was deafening in the silence of the woods. Eliza felt exposed, naked. Every bird that flew up, every squirrel that chattered seemed to be mocking her. Prisoner, slave, thief. Jonah stayed 10 paces ahead, his rifle in the crook of his arm. He did not look back constantly, which she appreciated. He gave her the dignity of her struggle, but every time she stumbled, he stopped. He did not rush to pick her up. He waited, letting her find her footing, letting her know he was there but not taking her strength from her. They covered 5 miles that first afternoon. It was a pathetic distance for a woodsman, but a marathon for Eliza. Her legs trembled uncontrollably, the muscles in her thighs screaming. As dusk began to purple the sky, they came to a crossroads near the edge of the mining territory. There was a small trading post there, a squat log building that served as a supply point for trappers and prospectors. "We need oil," Jonah said, stopping in the tree line. "And I need to trade for a heavy file. If we cannot get to the mission, I might have to try to cut them myself." Eliza leaned against a pine tree, gasping for air. "Can I stay here?" she asked, terrified of being seen. Jonah shook his head. "Too dangerous to leave you alone. If a cougar comes, or a scout, no. You stay close to me." He draped a heavy wool poncho over her, covering her shoulders and falling low enough to hide the shackles if she stood still. "Keep the staff close to your leg," he instructed. "Do not speak." They walked up to the porch. The wooden planks creaked under their boots. Jonah opened the door, and a small bell jingled, a cheerful sound that felt obscene given the danger. The inside of the post smelled of sawdust, tobacco, and dried apples. A pot-belly stove glowed in the center. Behind the counter stood a man with a bald head and spectacles, wiping a glass. "Evening." "Silas," Jonah said, walking to the counter. The storekeeper looked up. "Jonah. Haven't seen you since the thaw?" Jonah nodded. "Been high up? Need a tin of lard, a sack of coffee, and a 10-inch mill file. Best steel you have." Silas turned to the shelves to gather the goods. His eyes flicked to Eliza, who stood near the door, clutching the staff, the poncho pulling tight around her form. She tried to stand still, but her legs were spasming from the exertion. She shifted her weight. Clink. The sound was soft, but in the quiet store, it was unmistakable. Silas froze. He turned slowly, his eyes dropping to the floor. The hem of the poncho had risen just an inch, revealing the dull gray iron of the cuff around her left ankle. Silas looked back at Jonah, his face hardening. He set the coffee sack down on the counter with a heavy thud. "You bringing trouble into my shop?" "Jonah?" Silas asked, his voice losing its friendly cadence. "No trouble," Jonah said evenly. "Just commerce. That looks like company iron," Silas said, pointing a finger at Eliza. "I know the look of it. Kestrel's mark. Is she a convict? Or a runaway?" Eliza shrank back against the doorframe. She saw the judgment in the storekeeper's eyes. He did not see a woman in distress. He saw a thief. He saw a criminal who had broken the social order. In the West, property was sacred, and contracts were iron. To break one was a sin worse than violence. "She is under my protection," Jonah said. His voice did not rise, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Silas narrowed his eyes. There is a bounty notice posted in Silverton. $50 for a woman who smashed a foreman's skull and ran off with company funds. They say she is dangerous, Eliza gasped. That is a lie, she cried out, forgetting the instruction to be silent. I never hurt anyone. I never took a penny. Silas sneered. They always say that. He reached under the counter. The movement was subtle. The shift of a shoulder that meant a man was reaching for a weapon. A scattergun. Likely. Jonah did not draw his rifle. He simply leaned forward, placing his large, scarred hands flat on the countertop. He leaned into Silas's space, blocking the light. Leave the gun. Silas, Jonah said softly. The storekeeper hesitated, his hand frozen halfway to the shelf. Jonah continued, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the wood. You know me. You know I pay my debts. And you know I do not run with criminals. This woman is no thief. But the men hunting her, they are the sort that would burn your shop down just to see the sparks fly. He took a silver dollar from his pocket and slid it across the counter. It spun and settled with a ring. For the goods, and for your silence. Silas looked at the coin, then at Jonah's eyes. He saw the lethal seriousness there. He slowly withdrew his hand from beneath the counter. Empty. Take your things, Silas muttered, and get out. I don't want the sheriff seeing you here. Jonah gathered the supplies calmly. He did not rush. He walked to the door, took Eliza by the elbow, and guided her out. As the door closed, the bell jingled again, sounding like a knell. They walked for another hour in the dark, putting distance between themselves and the post. Jonah found a shelter, a shallow cave formed by a rockfall near a frozen stream. It was dry and out of the wind. He built a small fire, keeping it low to minimize the light. Eliza sat near the flames, shivering, not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash. He thinks I am a monster, she whispered. That man, he looked at me like I was a rabid dog. Jonah broke a stick and fed it to the fire. People believe what is easiest to believe, he said. It is easier to believe you are a villain than to believe a rich man is a devil. If Kestrel is a devil, then they are cowards for doing business with him. If you are a thief, they are righteous for hating you. Eliza looked at him across the firelight. The shadows danced on his face, softening the hard lines. He had stood between her and the gun without blinking. Why are you doing this? She asked. You could have walked away at the creek. You could have walked away at the store. Jonah poured water into a small pot to boil coffee. He was silent for a long time. The wind sighed outside the cave mouth. I had a wife, he said finally, Sarah, and a boy. Eliza held her breath. He had not spoken of himself before. She died 5 years ago, Jonah said, staring into the coals. It was the fever. I was away trapping when she took sick. By the time I got back, the town doctor had already given up. He said he wouldn't waste medicine on a hopeless case. He saved it for the mayor's wife, who was also sick. He looked up, his eyes bleak. Sarah died holding my hand. She was in so much pain, and I was helpless. I had all the strength in the world, and I could not lift the weight off her chest. He paused, shifting a log with his boot. When I saw you in the water, when I saw that iron, it was a weight I could lift. It was something I could fight. I am not doing this for you, Eliza May. I am doing it because I am tired of watching the strong crush the weak. Eliza felt a stinging in her eyes. She shifted, dragging her leg closer to him. She reached out, her hand hovering in the air before settling tentatively on his forearm. His muscle was hard as wood beneath the buckskin sleeve. You are a good man, Jonah Blackwood, she said softly. He looked at her hand on his arm. He did not pull away. It has been so long, Eliza whispered, her voice trembling, since someone touched me without wanting to hurt me or take from me. Jonah looked at her. In the firelight, the dirt and the exhaustion faded, and he saw only the woman beneath. He saw the curve of her jaw, the fullness of her lower lip, the deep, soulful darkness of her eyes. He turned his hand over, catching her fingers in his. His grip was warm and engulfing. You are safe here, he said. The air between them changed. It grew heavy, charged with a sudden, sharp electricity. It was not the desperate bargaining of the morning. It was recognition. Two lonely people, battered by the world, finding a frequency that matched. Eliza leaned forward slightly. She saw his gaze drop to her lips, then flick back up to her eyes. She felt a pull in her chest, a physical ache that had nothing to do with her injuries. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted to know that she was still a woman, not just a broken thing in chains. Jonah leaned in, drawn by a gravity he couldn't resist. Their faces were inches apart. She could feel the warmth of his breath. She closed her eyes, her lips parting slightly. Then, the chain on her ankle shifted. Clink! The sound broke the spell. Jonah pulled back sharply, releasing her hand. He stood up, turning away to check the darkness outside the cave, his posture rigid. "We should sleep," he said, his voice rough. "We have 20 miles to cover tomorrow." Eliza sat back, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her heart was racing, flushed with a mixture of shame and longing. She touched her lips where his breath had been. She lay down on the hard ground, pulling the poncho over her. She watched his silhouette against the stars at the cave entrance. He was keeping watch. He was her shield. And for the first time in 2 years, despite the iron on her legs and the men hunting her, Eliza Mayhart fell asleep with a small, fragile hope burning in her chest. The San Cristobal mission sat on a high plateau where the wind smelled of sage and dried earth. It was a humble collection of adobe buildings, whitewashed and peeling, centered around a chapel with a bell that had not rung clearly in 10 years. To Eliza Mayhart, stumbling through the heavy wooden gates with Jonah Blackwood's arm around her waist. It looked like the gates of heaven itself. They were met not by angels, but by Sister Beatrice, a woman of 60 with a face weathered like old leather and eyes that had seen every sorrow the territory could offer. She did not ask questions. She simply looked at the way Eliza leaned against Jonah, saw the gray exhaustion in their faces, and ushered them toward the infirmary. It was only when they were inside the clean, spare room with its scent of lavender and lye soap that Jonah lifted the hem of the poncho. Sister Beatrice drew in a sharp breath, her hand flying to the crucifix at her neck. "Sweet Mother of God," she whispered. She did not turn away. She called for Thomas. Thomas was the mission blacksmith, a man whose shoulders were as wide as a door frame. He had been a slave in Georgia before the war, and he carried the silence of a man who had walked through fire. When he entered the room, filling the space with the smell of coal smoke and iron, he looked at Eliza with a gentleness that belied his size. Jonah lifted Eliza onto the examination table. "Show him," he said softly. Eliza pulled up the sodden wool of her skirt. The iron cuffs were dull and ugly against her bruised skin. The linen Jonah had wrapped them in was frayed and stained with dried blood. Thomas knelt. He did not touch the metal at first. He leaned in, adjusting his spectacles, peering at the rivets that held the cuffs closed. He ran a massive, calloused finger along the seam of the iron. "This is not hammerwork," Thomas rumbled, his voice deep and gravelly. "What do you mean?" Jonah asked, standing protectively at Eliza's shoulder. Thomas looked up, his dark eyes hard. "A blacksmith leaves a mark. A hammer leaves a texture. This rivet, it was pressed, machine-pressed. And the iron, see here?" He pointed to a small ridge on the cuff. "This was cast in a mold. They are pouring these by the hundred. This ain't one man with a grudge. This is a factory." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It confirmed what Jonah had feared and what Eliza had lived. Kestrel Ridge was not just a mine. It was a prison that manufactured its own chains. "Can you get them off?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded slowly. "I can, but it will not be easy. Child, I cannot use heat, or I will burn your skin. I have to use a cold chisel and a heavy hammer. I have to cut the rivet head off. It will be loud, and you must not move. If you move, the chisel could slip." "I won't move," Eliza said. She gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. They moved to the forge. It was a cavernous space, dark save for the glow of the embers in the pit. Thomas had Eliza sit on a sturdy oak chair, her leg resting on the heavy anvil. Jonah knelt beside her. He took both of her hands in his. "Look at me," he said. "Do not look at the hammer. Just look at me." Thomas positioned the chisel against the iron rivet on her left ankle. The steel tip dug into the soft iron of the fastener. "Ready," Thomas said. He swung the hammer. Clang! The sound was a pistol shot in the enclosed space. The vibration shivered up Eliza's shin bone, a jarring shock that made her teeth ache. She gasped, her body jerking instinctively. "Steady," Jonah said, his voice an anchor. He squeezed her hands. "Look at my eyes." "Eliza, right here." She locked her gaze on his. His eyes were gray and calm, a storm at rest. He was pouring his strength into her, willing her to be still. Clang! Another strike. She saw Jonah flinch slightly with every blow, as if he were taking the impact for her. Clang! The rivet head sheared off. Thomas grunted and used a pair of heavy tongs to pry the iron band open. It groaned, a screech of metal fatigue, and then fell away. It hit the dirt floor with a heavy thud. Eliza let out a sob, but Thomas was already moving to the right leg. Again. Thomas said, the process repeated. The violence of the noise, the smell of the iron dust, the heat of the forge. But through it all, there was Jonah. He did not look away. He did not let go. He was the only steady thing in a world that was shaking apart. When the second cuff fell, the silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stepped back, wiping his brow with a rag. He kicked the shackles into the corner with a look of disgust. "Burn the table they were made on," he muttered. Eliza looked down. Her ankles were bare. They were hideous, swollen, purple, ringed with raw. Weeping sores and bands of white. Dead skin where the iron had choked the life out of the flesh. They were scarred. They would always be scarred. But they were free. She tried to move her foot. It felt impossibly light, as if it might float away. "Eliza?" Jonah whispered. She began to shake. It started in her hands and swept through her body like a gale. She slid off the chair, her legs buckling, and Jonah caught her before she hit the ground. He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her so tightly that she could feel the beat of his heart against her ear. She wept. She wailed. A sound of pure, unadulterated release that echoed off the stone walls of the forge. She cried for the pain, for the humiliation, for the days she had spent dragging that weight through the mud. She cried because she was standing on the earth with nothing holding her to it but gravity. Jonah held her, rocking her gently, his chin resting on the top of her head. He did not hush her. He let her pour it out, absorbing her grief into his own body. For 3 days, they stayed at the mission. Sister Beatrice tended to Eliza's wounds with salves made of beeswax and arnica. The swelling began to go down, revealing the deep, silver lines that would forever wring her ankles. Jonah was not idle. He spent the days in the small guest room, spreading out the contents of his saddlebags and the few scraps of paper Eliza had managed to smuggle out in the lining of her dress. He sat at a small wooden table, piecing together a map of corruption. He had fragments of a ledger page Eliza had stolen. It showed columns of figures, costs for food, tools, and security rental. Next to the dates were initials, D.H., Deputy Hatcher. "It is a circuit," Jonah said one evening as the rain lashed against the adobe walls. He pointed to the papers. "The sheriff arrests drifters for vagrancy. He hands them over to Kestrel to work off the fine. Kestrel charges them for their keep. The deputy collects a fee for every month the prisoner stays." He looked up at Eliza, who was sitting by the fire, sewing a tear in her dress. "We have enough to go to the federal marshal in Denver," Jonah said. "This proves collusion. It proves slavery." Eliza stopped sewing. She looked at the fire, her expression distant. "We have enough to save ourselves," she said quietly. Jonah paused. He heard the hesitation in her voice. Eliza stood up and walked to the window. She was moving better now, though she still favored her left leg. She looked out at the dark silhouette of the mountains. "I cannot go to Denver." "Jonah?" "Not yet." Jonah stood slowly. "Why?" "Because of Clara," she said. She turned to face him. "Clara is 19. She has a cough that brings up blood. She was the one who distracted the guard so I could run." She knocked over a lantern and started a fire in the laundry. They beat her for it. I heard her screaming as I crawled under the fence. Eliza's eyes were dry and fierce. If I go to Denver, it will take weeks. By the time the marshals come back, if they come back, Clara will be dead, or she will be wishing she was. Jonah rubbed the back of his neck. Eliza, you are barely walking. If we go back there, if they catch you again, they won't catch me, she said. Because I am not running this time, I am hunting. She walked over to him and placed her hands on the table, leaning over the map he had drawn. I know where they keep the keys, she said. I know when the shift changes. I know where the supply wagons come in. Jonah looked at her. He saw the terror that still lived in the corners of her eyes. But he saw something else too. He saw a woman reclaiming her own story. If he forced her to leave, he would be just another man telling her what she could and could not do with her life. He would be saving her body but breaking her spirit. He let out a long breath, a sound of resignation and terrifying resolve. We will need horses, he said, and I will need more ammunition. The night before they were to leave, the mission was quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet stone. Eliza sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the guest room. A single candle burned on the nightstand, casting a warm, flickering light. She was braiding her hair, her fingers moving mechanically. There was a soft knock at the door. Come in, she said. Jonah entered. He had cleaned his gun. The scent of oil clung to him. He looked at her, then looked away, as if the intimacy of the small room was too much. I wanted to check the route with you one last time, he said, staying near the door. Eliza finished her braid and tied it off. We know the route. Jonah, he nodded. He did not leave. Eliza stood up. She walked across the room until she was standing 2 feet from him. She could feel the heat radiating from him. She looked at his hands, hands that had cleaned her wounds, carried her through the snow, and held her while the iron was cut from her flesh. She reached out and took his hand. It was a bold move, one that made her heart race. Jonah looked down at their joined fingers. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a touch so light it was almost a ghost. You do not have to do this, he said, his voice rough. You could stay here. I could go get her. No, Eliza said. I have to go, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid too, Jonah admitted. Not of the mine, Eliza said. She looked up into his face. I'm afraid that if I die tomorrow, I will have died without ever knowing what it is like to be touched by a man who loves me. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the sudden, undeniable truth of the word she had just used, love. It hung between them, terrifying and beautiful. Jonah made a sound in his throat, a low groan of surrender. He stepped closer, closing the distance. He raised his hand and cupped her cheek. His skin was rough, but his touch was reverent, as if she were made of something holy and fragile. Eliza, he whispered. He did not grab. He did not take. He waited. He waited for her to lean into his hand. He waited for her to nod. When she did, he lowered his head. The kiss was not like the storms they had survived. It was slow. It was a question asked and answered in the soft pressure of lips. It tasted of longing and the sharp, sweet relief of finally coming home. Eliza let out a sigh that shuddered through her entire body. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. For the first time in years, she felt her body not as a tool for labor or a vessel for pain, but as her own. She felt the strength of his chest against hers, the solid reality of him. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged. I will not let them touch you, he swore, his voice fierce with a possessive tenderness. I will burn the whole world down before I let them put chains on you again. I know, she whispered. She led him to the narrow bed. There was no hurry, no frantic grasping. Every touch was a negotiation, a silent request for permission. When his hand brushed her waist, he paused, waiting for her to pull him closer. When she ran her hands over the scars on his back, he shuddered. In the candlelight, stripped of the layers of wool and leather, They were just two scarred people finding a way to fit together. It was an act of defiance, in a world that wanted to own them, break them, and use them. They chose to give themselves to each other. It was the most dangerous thing they had ever done. They reached the perimeter of Kestrel Ridge 2 nights later. The mine did not sleep. It was a festering wound on the side of the mountain, lit by the hellish glow of coal fires and gas lanterns. The sound of it was a constant, grinding roar, crushers pulverizing rock, steam engines hissing, and the distant shouting of men. They left the horses in a ravine a mile back and moved in on foot. Jonah moved like a shadow, blending into the brush. Eliza followed, her heart pounding, but her steps sure. She knew this ground. She knew where the shale was loose and where the shadows were deepest. They reached a rise overlooking the main compound. Below them, the layout was clear. The administrative buildings, the processing plant, and the barracks, long, low buildings surrounded by a 12-foot fence topped with barbed wire. Jonah raised his field glasses. He scanned the yard. His jaw tightened. "Look," he said, handing the glasses to her. Eliza looked. In the center of the muddy yard, illuminated by a harsh spotlight, a man was tied to a whipping post. He was stripped to the waist. A company guard was striking him with a heavy leather belt. "That is Miller," Eliza whispered, nausea rising in her throat. "He fell in the shaft last week and broke his arm. They are beating him because he cannot meet his quota. They call it motivation." She shifted the glasses to the women's barracks. A group of women were being marched from the laundry to the sleeping quarters. They walked with their heads down. 2 of them dragged their feet, the telltale shuffle of Shackles. "See the man by the gate?" Eliza asked. "The one with the clipboard. That is the clerk. He keeps the ledger. And behind him, that shed with the double padlock? Yes, that is the storeroom," she said. "I saw inside it once when the door was left open. It is floor to ceiling. Jonah, rows and rows of them." Jonah took the glasses back. He looked at the shed. It was an arsenal, not of guns, but of slavery. "We go in through the drainage culvert on the north side," Eliza said. "It comes up behind the kitchen. That is where Clara works the night shift." They moved down the slope, becoming part of the darkness. The culvert was a rusted pipe, half filled with freezing sludge that smelled of rotten vegetables and grease. They crawled through it, the muck soaking their knees. They emerged into the shadow of the mess hall. The air here was thick with coal dust and the smell of boiled cabbage. Eliza peeked through a crack in the kitchen siding. Inside, amidst clouds of steam, women were scrubbing massive iron pots. "There," Eliza pointed. Clara was at the far sink. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was translucent, her eyes sunken. She coughed, a racking spasm that bent her double. But she didn't stop scrubbing. She knew the cost of stopping. Jonah touched Eliza's shoulder. "I will take the guard at the door. You get her. We have 3 minutes before the patrol passes." Jonah moved. He approached the guard, a heavy man leaning against the door frame smoking a pipe. From behind, it was over in a second. Jonah's arm clamped around the man's throat, cutting off his air. He dragged him into the shadows and lowered him to the ground. Unconscious. Eliza slipped inside the door. "Clara," she hissed. The girl spun around, dropping a ladle. Her eyes went wide with shock. "Eliza, you're dead. They said you were dead." "I am here," Eliza said, grabbing her arm. "I am getting you out." Clara pulled back. "I can't. My debt. They said if I run, they will add $50 to my mother's account in town. They are lying. Clara, it is all a lie. Come with me." She dragged the stunned girl toward the door. But as they stepped out into the night, disaster struck. The guard Jonah had choked was waking up faster than he should have. He groaned and kicked out, his boot striking a stack of metal wash buckets. Crash! The sound echoed across the compound like thunder. In the yard, heads turned. A whistle blew, shrill and piercing. "Run!" Jonah shouted, abandoning stealth. He grabbed Clara's other arm, and they sprinted toward the culvert. But the camp was awake now. Men were pouring out of the bunkhouse. "There!" a voice screamed. "Shoot them!" A gunshot cracked the air. Dirt kicked up at Eliza's feet. They reached the fence line, but the culvert was blocked by 2 men running to cut them off. "To the river!" Eliza screamed. "The ravine!" She changed direction, leading them away from the pipe and toward a steep drop-off where the mine waste was dumped. It was a treacherous slide of loose shale that ended in the roaring white water of the Animus River. They scrambled up the berm. More shots rang out. Jonah grunted. A sharp, wet sound. He stumbled, his stride breaking. "Jonah!" Eliza cried. Grabbing his jacket, "I'm fine," he gasped, but his face had gone gray in the moonlight. He clutched his left side. Blood was already seeping between his fingers, dark and slick. He couldn't lift his left arm. The protector was wounded. Eliza looked at him, then at Clara, who was sobbing in terror. She looked back at the camp, where lanterns were bobbing like angry fireflies. Getting closer. There was no time for fear. There was no time to be the victim. "Grab his belt," Eliza ordered Clara, her voice hard as iron. "Help him!" Eliza grabbed Jonah's good arm and threw it over her shoulder. She took the weight of him, the man who had carried her. "Move," she commanded. She led them over the edge of the ravine. They slid down the loose rock in a cloud of dust and noise, tumbling and scrambling toward the water below. The river roared, cold and deadly, but it was the only path that led away from the chains. Eliza May's heart did not tremble. Her legs did not shake. She dug her heels into the sliding earth, holding fast to the man she loved and the friend she had returned for, guiding them into the dark, wild unknown. The shelter lay deep within the throat of Red Rock Canyon, a place where the earth had split open to reveal veins of sandstone the color of dried blood. It was a natural alcove, protected by a leaning slab of granite and hidden behind a screen of twisted juniper. Here, the wind did not scream. It whispered, carrying the scent of dust and ancient resin. Jonah Blackwood lay on a bed of pine boughs and blankets, his face gray and beaded with sweat. The bullet from the mine guard's rifle had furrowed along his left side, cracking a rib and tearing a jagged line through the muscle before exiting. It was not a killing wound, but it was a cruel one. It stole his breath and turned every movement into a white-hot spike of agony. For 2 days, Eliza May Hart had been the one to fetch the water from the seep in the rock. She had been the one to scout the canyon rim, holding Jonah's heavy Winchester rifle with arms that had grown stronger than she realized. She had been the one to clean the wound, boiling water in their small tin pot and tearing strips from her petticoat to pack the flesh. On the 3rd evening, the sun dipped below the canyon walls, turning the sky a bruised purple. Jonah tried to sit up, his hand going instinctively to his side. He hissed through his teeth, a sharp intake of breath that echoed in the small space. "Stay down," Eliza said. She was kneeling by the small fire, stirring a broth made from dried beef and wild onions she had dug from the creek bank. Her voice was no longer the whisper of the girl in the creek. It was firm, tempered by necessity. "I am useless lying here," Jonah grumbled, though he eased himself back down. "We need to move. Hatcher will not stop searching." "He will look in the passes," Eliza said, bringing the steaming cup to him. "He will think we are running for the border. He will not think we have gone to ground in a box canyon 10 miles from his doorstep. Drink this." Jonah took the cup. His hand brushed hers. He looked at her, really looked at her, through the haze of pain and fever that was finally lifting. The bruises on her face from her time at the camp were fading into yellow shadows. Her hair, once matted with mud, was clean now, braided tightly back from a face that had sharpened. The softness of fear was gone, replaced by the lean geometry of survival. "You have saved me, Eliza May," Jonah said quietly. "I aimed to be your shield, and instead, I became a burden." Eliza sat back on her heels. She looked at the fire, watching the flames lick at the dry wood. "You are not a burden. Jonah, you are the reason I am breathing, but I am not the same woman you pulled out of the water." She looked at him then, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. There was a turbulence in them, a storm that had nothing to do with the mine or the men hunting them. "What are you?" Jonah asked. Eliza placed her hand on her own chest, over her heart. "I am angry," she said, "and I am alive. For 2 years, I was a ghost. I moved when they told me to move. I slept when they told me to sleep. I made myself small so they would not break me. But you—" She hesitated, then reached out and touched the bandage on his side. "You bled for me. You took a bullet meant for my back, and watching you lie here, fearing that the light might go out of your eyes, it woke something up in me." Jonah set the cup down. The air in the shelter shifted. The vast silence of the canyon seemed to press in on them, intimate and heavy. "What did it wake up?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Eliza moved closer. She was on her knees, crawling across the blankets until she was beside him. She did not look away. "I want to feel something other than fear," she said. "I want to feel something other than cold. I want to know that this body is mine again, not Kestrel's, not the debt's, mine." She reached out and took his hand, placing it against her cheek. She turned her face into his palm, closing her eyes. Jonah's heart hammered against his ribs, a rhythm that hurt but made him feel fiercely alive. He had spent 5 years mourning the dead, closing himself off from the warmth of the living because the loss cost too much. But this woman, this fierce, broken, beautiful survivor, was offering him a way back. "Eliza," he whispered, "I am a man made of scars. I have nothing to give you but a hard life and a fight. That is all I want," she said. She leaned down and kissed him. It was not tentative. It was a claim. She kissed him with the hunger of someone who had been starving, not for food, but for humanity. Jonah groaned, a sound torn from his chest, and his good arm came up to wrap around her waist. He pulled her down to him. The pain in his side flared, but it was distant now, drowned out by the overwhelming heat of her skin against his. Eliza pulled back slightly, her hands resting on his chest. She looked down at him, her gaze traveling over his face, his throat, his shoulders. She was mapping him, and in doing so, she was mapping herself. She sat up and slowly began to undo the buttons of her bodice. Her fingers trembled, not from shame, but from the sheer magnitude of the choice. For years, her body had been a source of vulnerability, a thing to be hidden and protected. Now, she was choosing to share it. She was turning it into a gift. Jonah watched her with a reverence that made her throat tight. He did not rush her. He did not grab. He simply witnessed her. When she slid the dress from her shoulders, the firelight caught the pale curve of her skin. She was thin, her ribs visible beneath the surface, a testament to the cruelty she had endured. But to Jonah, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He reached up and touched the hollow of her throat. "You are beautiful," he said. Eliza let out a shaky breath. She lowered herself onto him, careful of his wound, fitting her body against his. Skin met skin. Warmth met warmth. It was a shock, a revelation. When they finally joined together, it was slow and achingly tender. It was a conversation without words. Eliza set the pace, reclaiming the rhythm of her own life. With every touch, every breath, she scrubbed away the memory of the iron. She washed away the shame of the camp. She was not a number in a ledger. She was a woman, loved and loving, under the vast, indifferent stars of the West. For Jonah, it was a return to the world of the living. Her weight on him was an anchor, holding him to the earth. Her breath against his neck was a promise that the past did not have to define the future. They fell asleep, wrapped in each other, the fire dying down to embers. Two fugitives who had found a kingdom in the dust. The morning brought the cold reality of daylight. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the wind carried the bite of approaching winter. They broke camp efficiently. Clara, the young woman they had rescued, had been left 2 days prior at a trapper's dugout 5 miles north, a man Jonah trusted with his life. An old Frenchman named Pierre, who would hide her until the snows melted. Now, it was just Jonah and Eliza, and the war they had chosen to fight. They rode double on Jonah's horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had been grazing in the canyon bottom. They headed south, away from the Kestrel territory, aiming for the mining settlement of Silver Creek. It was a risk, but they needed supplies, and they needed information. Silver Creek was a town built on hope and mud. False-fronted buildings lined a single street that churned with wagons and riders. The air smelled of coal smoke and unwashed men. Jonah pulled his hat low and turned up the collar of his coat. Eliza wore her poncho, the hood drawn up to shadow her face. They hitched the horse at the edge of town and walked toward the general store, moving with the caution of wolves entering a pasture. They did not make it to the door. Nailed to the rough wood of the livery stable was a sheet of paper. It was fresh, the ink still dark. Wanted Eliza May Hart for grand larceny, destruction of property, and breach of contract. Also seeking an accomplice, name unknown. A drifter armed and dangerous. Reward, $200. Eliza stared at the paper. The words swam before her eyes. Larceny. Destruction. They had turned her survival into a crime. Jonah reached out and tore the poster down, crumpling it in his fist. His jaw was set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. They are afraid, he said quietly. Men do not offer $200 for a washerwoman unless she knows something that can hang them. They walked on, but the town felt different now. Every glance from a passerby felt like an accusation. A woman sweeping her porch stopped and stared at Eliza's muddy hem. A group of miners loitering in front of a saloon stopped talking as they passed, their eyes tracking them with predatory curiosity. Prejudice was a physical weight. It was in the way the shopkeeper hesitated before taking Jonah's coin. It was in the whisper that followed them down the boardwalk. The power of the Kestrel Ridge Mining Company stretched far beyond its fences. It owned the fear of the territory. We need allies, Jonah said as they sat in the corner of a dimly lit chop house, nursing cups of bitter coffee. We cannot fight a lawless man with bullets alone. We need the law, the real law. There is a man, Eliza said, remembering a scrap of conversation she had heard in the camp kitchen. A journalist. He came to the mine 6 months ago asking questions about safety regulations. Kestrel had him escorted off the property at gunpoint. His name was Thorne, Elias Thorne, and the land agent. Jonah added, Arthur Vance. I heard the trading post owner speak of him. He is in town to survey the new railway easements. He is a federal man. He does not answer to the local sheriff. They found Elias Thorne in the back room of the local printing press, a man with ink-stained fingers and a suit that had seen better decades. He was drinking whiskey from a teacup and reading a newspaper from St. Louis. When Jonah and Eliza told him their story, Thorne did not gasp. He did not look horrified. He looked weary. I believe you, Thorne said, pouring more whiskey. I know Kestrel is a butcher. Everyone knows it, but knowing it and printing it are two different things. If I print this without proof, absolute, undeniable proof, Kestrel will sue me for libel, burn my press, and likely have me shot in an alley. I have scars, Eliza said, her voice trembling with frustration. Is that not proof? Thorne looked at her kindly, but his eyes were sad. Scars are stories, Miss Hart. In a court of law, Kestrel will say you were mad. He will say you did it to yourself. He will say it was a medical necessity to keep you from hurting others. I need paper. I need witnesses who are not fugitives. They found Arthur Vance at the surveyor's office. He was a stiff, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a belief in the sanctity of federal statutes. He listened to them with a frown, tapping a pencil against his desk. The debt penitence system is a gray area, Vance admitted. Immoral, certainly. But if the contracts are signed, if the debts are documented, the territory allows for indentured labor to repay criminal fines. It is slavery, Jonah said, his voice rising. It is peonage, Vance corrected dryly. And it is illegal under the Anti-Peonage Act of 1867. But again, I need evidence. I cannot call in the UANS. Marshals on the word of a wanted woman and a hunter. Bring me the contracts. Bring me sworn affidavits from 20 people who were held against their will. Then I can move. 20 people, Eliza whispered as they left the office. We might as well try to move the mountain. They walked back toward the horses. The town was busy, the noise of commerce filling the air. As they passed a tack shop, a heavy draft horse was being harnessed to a freight wagon. The teamster threw a heavy logging chain across the wagon bed. Rattle, clank. The sound was loud, metallic, and heavy. Eliza stopped dead. The street vanished. The sunlight vanished. Suddenly, she was back in the barracks. It was dark. The air smelled of unwashed bodies and fear. The guard was coming down the row, the keys jingling, the heavy iron chains dragging on the floor. Clank! Drag! Clank! She couldn't breathe. Her throat closed up. She clawed at her neck, gasping. Her legs gave way, and she began to sink to the boardwalk, her hands over her ears. "No," she whimpered. "No, please, I'm working." "I'm working." Passers-by stopped to stare. A woman in a bonnet pulled her child away. Jonah was there instantly. He did not grab her. He stepped between her and the wagon, blocking the sight of the chains. He crouched down, creating a wall with his broad shoulders. "Eliza," he said. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating in his chest. She looked at him, her eyes wide and unseeing. The panic was a living thing, clawing at her inside. "Listen to my voice," Jonah said. "You are in Silver Creek. You are on a boardwalk. That is a wagon horse. It is not him." He reached out and took her wrists, gently pulling her hands away from her ears. "Feel my hands," he said. "These are my hands. You are free." Eliza blinked. The world slowly reassembled itself. She saw the dusty street. She saw the confusion on the faces of the strangers. She saw Jonah, his eyes fierce and protective. She took a ragged breath, then another. The shame washed over her, hot and stinging. She had broken down in public. She was weak. "I am sorry," she whispered. Jonah stood up and pulled her to her feet. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm. "Do not apologize for the injury they gave you," he said. "We will heal it, but it will take time." He led her to the horses. "We have work to do. Vance wants 20 voices. We will get him 20 voices." And so began the journey. For the next 3 weeks, Jonah and Eliza ceased to be running from something. They began to run toward it. They became collectors of tragedy. They rode out of the shelter of the timber and onto the high, bleak plains, where the wind cut through wool and leather like a knife. The landscape was vast and indifferent, a sea of brown grass under a sky that seemed too big for the earth. They sought out the people on the list Eliza had reconstructed from memory, the ones who had been released, or broken and discarded. They found a woman named Mary in a sod house near the Wyoming border. She was 20 years old, but looked 40. She held a baby on her hip that was too thin. When Eliza asked about Kestrel Ridge, Mary spat on the dirt floor. "They charged me for the doctor when my first baby died," Mary said, her voice flat. "They added the coffin to my debt, $7 for a pine box. I worked 6 months to pay for a dead child." Jonah wrote it down, every word. They found a man named Samuel living in a lean-to near a logging camp. He had lost 3 fingers on his right hand. "I was a blaster," Samuel told them, warming his maimed hand by their campfire. "The fuse was wet. It blew early. Kestrel charged me for the lost dynamite. Said I wasted company property. They chained me to the bed until the stump healed, then sent me back to the pit." Jonah wrote it down. They rode through snowstorms that blinded them, the white flakes stinging their faces like sand. They slept in abandoned line shacks and under rock overhangs. They ate jerky and snow melt. The hardship stripped them down to their essentials. There was no room for pretense in the high country. They relied on each other completely. Jonah taught Eliza how to shoot the Winchester, how to brace it against her shoulder so the recoil didn't bruise her. Eliza taught Jonah how to listen, really listen, to the people they met, how to draw out the shame they were hiding and turn it into testimony. Each story added a brick to the wall they were building around Harlan Kestrel, and with each story, the pattern became clearer. It was not random. It was targeted. The women they targeted were orphans, widows, immigrants who spoke little English. They were the morally disposable. The company knew that no father, no husband, no brother would come looking for them. They were chosen because they were alone. One evening, they camped near the ruins of an old stagecoach station. The wind was howling, rattling the loose boards of the structure. Jonah was organizing the stack of affidavits they had collected. He held up a piece of paper, frowning in the lantern light. "Eliza," he said, "look at this." He had been comparing the dates on the testimonies with the notes Eliza had made about her own timeline. "What is it?" she asked, moving to sit beside him. "Your contract," Jonah said. You told me you signed it on October the 4th, 1877, the day you arrived. Yes, Eliza said. I remember the date. It was my birthday. Jonah tapped the paper. And you told me the debt they used to hold you was your mother's medical debt? That Kestrel bought it from the town doctor? Yes, my mother died on September 1st. Jonah looked at her, his eyes intense. Eliza. The doctor in Silverton died in August of that year. I remember it because the town had no physician when the fever hit. Eliza stared at him. What are you saying? I am saying that a dead doctor cannot sell a debt in September. He pulled a charcoal stick from the fire and wrote the dates on a flat stone. If the doctor was dead, the transfer of debt to Kestrel was forged. Kestrel didn't buy your debt. He invented it. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She had spent 2 years believing that, however cruel, her captivity was technically legal. She had believed she owed them. He stole me, she whispered. It wasn't just a trap. It was a lie from the very first mark on the paper. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. All the shame she had carried, the nagging feeling that perhaps she was a debtor, that perhaps she did deserve to work it off, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. She looked at Jonah. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, but his eyes were burning. This makes it federal fraud, Jonah said. Using the mail to transport fraudulent contracts, falsifying documents to a federal land agent to claim worker residency. This is the key. Eliza, this is the nail in his coffin. Eliza reached out and took the paper from his hand. She smoothed it out on her knee. Her hand was steady. Her legs were still. We have the proof, she said. We do. Jonah agreed, but taking it back to Silverton, into the courtroom. That will be the hardest part. Kestrel will have gunmen. He will have the judge in his pocket. Eliza looked at the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall. Then she looked at the stack of testimonies, the voices of Mary, Samuel, Clara, and a dozen others. Let him have his gunmen, she said. We have the truth, and we have each other. She stood up and walked to the door of the ruin. The wind was still screaming, but the storm was breaking. To the east, a faint line of gray light was appearing on the horizon. Saddle the horses. Jonah, she said, turning back to him. We are going back to Silver Creek, and we are going to burn his kingdom down. Jonah watched her. She stood silhouetted against the dawn. Not a victim, not a survivor, but an avenging angel in a wool poncho. He stood up, wincing slightly as his healing ribs pulled, and nodded. Yes, ma'am, he said. He began to pack the saddlebags. The hunter and the hunted had become something else entirely. They were the storm now, and they were headed straight for Kestrel Ridge. Silverton was not merely a town that day. It was a stage set for commerce. The main street was draped in bunting, red and white and blue, snapping in the biting November wind. A brass band from Denver played on the steps of the courthouse, the music clashing with the rattle of carriage wheels and the shouting of vendors selling roasted chestnuts and mining shares. It was the quarterly investors' meeting for the San Juan district. Men with clean fingernails and heavy gold watch chains had arrived from the east to inspect their dividends. This was the day Harlan Kestrel would shine brightest. This was the day money changed hands, and silence was bought for another season. Jonah Blackwood and Eliza May Hart rode into town not from the main road, but down the muddy switchbacks of the lumber trail. They did not hide. They rode straight down the center of Green Street, their horse weary, their clothes stained with the dust of 300 miles of high plains travel. People turned to look. They saw a mountain man with a bandage showing beneath his coat and a woman wrapped in a faded wool poncho, riding behind him with a face like carved flint. They tied the horse at the rail in front of the Standard newspaper office. Elias Thorne was waiting for them in the doorway, a cigarette burning nervously between his fingers. You are late, Thorne hissed, glancing up the street toward the courthouse. Kestrel is already speaking. The land agent is there. The judge is there. We had to dodge a patrol near the river, Jonah said, helping Eliza down. Do you have the press ready? Thorne nodded. The plates are set, but I cannot run the ink until I see it happen. Jonah, if I print this and Kestrel walks out of that room a free man, I am a dead man. He will not walk out, Eliza said. She reached into the saddlebag and pulled out the heavy canvas sack that contained the evidence, the ledger pages, the affidavits from 20 witnesses, and the iron shackles wrapped in a cloth. Thorne looked at the sack, then at Eliza. There is a deputy at the door. Hatcher, he has orders to arrest you on sight. I know, Jonah said. He looked at Eliza. The plan remains. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. I go in when the shouting starts. Jonah reached out and touched her cheek. His hand was rough, warm, and familiar. It was the only anchor she had in a world tilting toward violence. Do not stop, he said softly. No matter what they say to you, no matter what they call you, you walk to that table. I will walk, she promised. Jonah turned and stepped into the street. He did not skulk. He walked with the long, predatory stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. He headed straight for the courthouse steps, where Deputy Hatcher stood leaning against a pillar, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. Hatcher saw him coming. The deputy straightened, his hand dropping to the Colt Navy revolver on his hip. He smiled, a slow, cruel expression that did not reach his eyes. Well now, Hatcher called out, his voice carrying over the crowd. Look what the cat dragged in, the dog thief. The crowd turned. The music faltered. Jonah stopped 10 feet from the steps. I am here to speak to the land agent. Hatcher, step aside. Hatcher laughed. You are here to hang. Blackwood. And where is your little whore? Did you leave her in the woods when she got too heavy to carry? Jonah did not flinch. He let the insult hang in the air. Let the crowd hear the ugliness of it. Take me in, Jonah said loudly. Take me to the judge. I have a confession to make. He raised his hand slowly. Hatcher narrowed his eyes, suspicious of the surrender. But the bounty was too high to ignore, and the audience was too large to disappoint. He stepped forward, unhooking a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Turn around, Hatcher barked. Jonah turned. As soon as Hatcher reached for him, Jonah moved. It was not an attack. It was a performance. He jerked his arm away. Shoving Hatcher back, I said take me to the judge, Jonah shouted. Hatcher roared and swung his pistol, the barrel striking Jonah across the temple. Jonah went down on one knee, blood springing bright and red against his skin. The crowd gasped. 2 other deputies rushed from the side, grabbing Jonah by the arms. They hauled him up, rough and violent, dragging him up the stairs. Open the doors, Hatcher yelled. I want the judge to see this trash. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open. The noise of the struggle spilled inside, interrupting the polished speech of Harlan Kestrel. This was the moment. Eliza stepped out from the shadow of the newspaper office. She clutched the canvas sack to her chest. She did not run. She walked. She walked through the wake of the violence, past the stunned townspeople who were whispering behind their hands. That's her. That's the Hart girl, the one who stole the money. She heard them. She felt their judgment like a physical weight, but she remembered Mary in the sod house. She remembered Clara scrubbing pots with bleeding hands. She remembered the iron. She walked up the stairs, past the blood droplets Jonah had left on the marble. She pushed through the open doors and entered the lion's den. The courtroom was packed. In the front row sat the investors, men in gray suits holding cigars. On the dais sat Judge Holloway, a man known for his love of whiskey and easy verdicts. And standing at the podium, frozen in mid-gesture, was Harlan Kestrel. He was handsome, Eliza had to admit. He had silver hair and a smile that could sell sand to a desert. But his eyes were shark's eyes, black and flat. Jonah was on his knees in front of the bench, blood running down his face, held in place by 2 deputies. Hatcher stood over him, panting. What is the meaning of this interruption? Judge Holloway demanded, banging his gavel. We caught him. Your Honor, Hatcher crowed. The accomplice. And we will find the girl soon enough. I am here, Eliza said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a bell. Every head turned. Eliza walked down the center aisle. She was small in her poncho, her boots worn and muddy, but she held her head high. She walked until she stood 10 feet from Harlan Kestrel. "Eliza May," Kestrel said, his voice dripping with a poisonous mix of pity and threat. "You poor, confused child. You have come to turn yourself in. I have come to return your property," Eliza said. She dropped the canvas sack on the plaintiff's table. It hit with a heavy, metallic thud. Hatcher stepped toward her, his face twisted. "You get back, you little slattern. You don't speak in this court. You speak when you are spoken to." "I am speaking to the law," Eliza said, turning her eyes to Arthur Vance, the federal land agent, who was sitting near the investors. "Mr. Vance, you are here to verify the legality of the district's operations." Vance adjusted his spectacles, looking uncomfortable. "I am, Miss Hart." "Then you should know that the Kestrel Ridge Mining Company is operating a debt peonage ring in violation of the Act of 1867, Eliza stated clearly. "They are forging contracts. They are holding citizens of the United States against their will, and they are using the county sheriff's office to enforce it." "Lies!" Kestrel shouted, his composure cracking. "She is a thief and a hysteric. She owes the company $300. She is mentally unstable. Look at her. She runs off with drifters and lives in the woods like an animal." Hatcher laughed. "A harsh, barking sound. That is right. Everyone knows what you are. Eliza, you are a camp follower. You traded your body for a ride out of town, didn't you? And now you come back here, pretending to be a lady. You are ruined. You are dirt." The room murmured. The sexual shame was a weapon, sharp and effective. In the 1870s, a woman's reputation was her life. To be called loose was to be cast out. Eliza felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She felt the old instinct to shrink, to hide, to accept the label. She looked at Jonah. He was bleeding, his hands cuffed behind his back, but his eyes were locked on hers. He nodded, a microscopic movement. Eliza took a breath. She let the poncho slide from her shoulders. She stood in her simple, mended dress. "I am a survivor," she said, her voice rising. "And survival is not a sin." She looked directly at the women in the back of the room, the wives of the merchants, the mothers of the town. "You call me ruined," she said. "You whisper that I am shamed. Why? Because I was hungry? Because I was alone? Because a man with power decided to take my life and put a price on it?" She walked to the table and untied the sack. She reached in and pulled out the iron shackles. They were rusted, ugly things. The cut rivets jagged where Thomas had sheared them. She held them up. The metal clinked. A cold, deadly sound in the warm room. "Is this the tool of a creditor?" Eliza asked. "Or is this the tool of a slaver?" She slammed the shackles down on the table. "My legs did not shake because I was weak," she said, her voice ringing off the rafters. "They shook because I was carrying 10 pounds of iron riveted to my flesh for 6 months. I was beaten, I was starved, and I was not the only one." The doors at the back of the room opened again. Sister Beatrice walked in, her habit flowing. Beside her was Thomas, the blacksmith, looking massive and grim. And behind them were 3 others, men and women from the town who had been too afraid to speak until now. "I can testify to the rivets," Thomas rumbled, his voice filling the room. "Those are company iron. I cut them off her legs myself. The flesh underneath was rotted. No Christian man puts irons on a woman." Sister Beatrice stepped forward. "I treated the wounds, Judge, and I have treated others. Girls thrown out of the camp when they were too sick to work. Broken. Used up." Harlan Kestrel's face went from red to white. He looked at the investors. They were staring at the shackles, their expressions shifting from annoyance to horror. This was bad for business. Slavery was bad for business. "This is a conspiracy," Kestrel shouted. "Get them out of here! Hatcher, arrest them all!" Hatcher looked at Kestrel, then at the crowd. He realized the tide was turning. He panicked. "He is escaping!" Hatcher yelled, pointing at Jonah, who had not moved. It was a lie, a pretext for violence. Hatcher drew his revolver again, aiming not at Jonah, but wildly, trying to create chaos. "No!" Eliza screamed. Jonah moved. He did not wait to be shot. He threw his shoulder into the deputy, holding his right arm, sending the man stumbling. He spun and kicked Hatcher in the knee. Hatcher howled and his gun went off, the bullet shattering a glass lamp on the wall. The room erupted. People screamed and dove under benches. Kestrel reached inside his coat. He pulled a Derringer, a small, deadly hideout gun. He aimed it at Eliza. She froze. She saw the black bore of the barrel, but Thomas was there. The blacksmith vaulted the railing with surprising speed. He swung a heavy wooden chair, smashing it into Kestrel's arm. The gun clattered to the floor. Jonah, hands still cuffed, drove his head into Hatcher's stomach, doubling the man over. He kneed the deputy in the face, a brutal, efficient blow that ended the fight instantly. "Order! Order in this court!" Judge Holloway screamed, cowering behind his bench. Arthur Vance, the land agent, stood up. He was a small man, but he held a federal badge in his hand. "Federal marshals!" he shouted. "Secure the room!" Two men in the back row, men who had looked like investors, stood up and drew long-barreled revolvers. They were not investors. They were Vance's protection. "Nobody moves," one of them commanded. The silence that followed was heavy with dust and smoke. Hatcher lay groaning on the floor. Kestrel was clutching his broken arm, his face a mask of shock. Jonah stood panting, blood dripping from his temple, his hands still bound behind him. Arthur Vance walked to the table. He picked up the ledger pages Eliza had brought. He looked at the dates. He looked at Kestrel. "Harlan Kestrel," Vance said, his voice dry and precise. "You are under arrest for violation of the Anti-Peonage Act, federal fraud, and kidnapping," Kestrel sneered, trying to regain his composure. "You cannot arrest me. I own this town. I own the judge. My lawyers in Denver will have me out by dinner." Eliza stepped forward. She placed her hands on the table, leaning in until she was inches from Kestrel's face. "You can buy the judge," she said softly. "You can buy the sheriff, but you cannot buy the truth. Not anymore." She turned to the investors, the men from the East who were hurriedly gathering their papers. "If you do business with him now," she said, "you are partners in this, and I will make sure every newspaper from St. Louis to New York knows your names." The lead investor looked at Kestrel, then at the shackles on the table. He put his hat on. "We are withdrawing our capital, Mr. Kestrel," he said coldly. "Good day." Kestrel sagged, the arrogance finally draining out of him as the marshals moved in to cuff him. One of the marshals approached Jonah. He looked at Vance. "Unlock him," Vance said. "He is a witness, not a criminal." The marshal unlocked Jonah's cuffs. Jonah rubbed his wrists, his eyes finding Eliza immediately. He did not care about the blood on his face. He crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms. "You did it," he whispered into her hair. "You walked." "We did it," she corrected, holding him tight. But it was not over. The town was in an uproar. As Kestrel and Hatcher were let out in chains, the crowd outside surged forward. Some cheered, but many were silent, angry, and confused. The mine was the lifeblood of the economy. If the mine closed, the town died. A shopkeeper yelled, "Who pays the wages now, girl? You?" Eliza pulled away from Jonah and walked to the courthouse doors. She looked out at the sea of faces. "The mine does not close," she shouted. The crowd quieted, listening. "The federal government seizes the assets," Eliza said, her voice steady. "The law says the wages must be paid, but they will be paid to free men and women, not to slaves." She pointed to the livery stable across the street. "There are 40 people still in that camp up the mountain. 40 people who are hungry and hurt. I want wagons. I want blankets. And I want men who are not cowards to ride up there and cut the locks." There was a long pause. The townspeople looked at one another. They looked at the woman who had stood up to the most powerful man in the district. They saw her scars. They saw the truth she had forced them to look at. Slowly, a man near the front, the owner of the feed store, stepped forward. "I have a wagon," he muttered. "I have blankets." A woman said from the back, "I can ride," a young miner added. It was not a cheer. It was not a parade. It was a slow, grudging shift. It was the sound of a conscience waking up. Jonah stood beside Eliza, his hand resting on the small of her back. He watched the town begin to organize, not out of charity, but out of a sudden, shamed necessity to be on the right side of history. He looked at Eliza. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading, leaving her exhausted, but she stood straight. "You started a fire, Eliza May," Jonah said. She looked at the shackles still lying on the judge's table. "Let it burn," she said. "Let it burn until every chain is melted." Arthur Vance approached them. "Miss Hart, Mr. Blackwood, I need your statements. We have a long night ahead of us. Kestrel has money. He will fight this." "Let him fight," Jonah said. "We have been fighting winter, starvation, and bullets. A lawyer does not scare us." Vance nodded. "There is one more thing, the remaining captives." "You said there were 40? Eliza nodded. "I have the list." "Then we go get them," Vance said. Tonight, the sun was setting as the caravan left Silverton. It was a strange procession. Federal marshals, guilt-ridden townsfolk, and 2 battered fugitives leading the way. Eliza rode beside Jonah. Her body ached. Her past was laid bare for everyone to see. She knew the whispers would follow her for years. She knew some would never forgive her for disrupting the order of things. But as they rode up the switchbacks, climbing toward the high country where the air was thin and clean, she looked down at her ankles. They were hidden by her skirt, but she could feel the phantom weight of the iron. She wiggled her toes in her boots. She looked at Jonah. He was watching the road, his rifle across his saddle, ever the protector, but the tension in his shoulders was gone. "Jonah?" she asked. He looked at her. "My legs," she said softly. "What about them?" "They aren't shaking." Jonah smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile with pure, unshadowed joy. "No," he said, "they are steady as a rock." They rode on into the darkening mountains, not to hide, but to finish what they had started. The Wild West was a hard place, a place of blood and iron. But that night, under the rising moon, it was also a place where justice had a name, and her name was Eliza. The winter of 1879 did not end with a gentle thaw. It ended with a deluge. The snow in the high passes turned to slush, sending torrents of brown water crashing down the ravines, washing away the roads and turning the streets of Silverton into a quagmire of sucking mud. Justice, Eliza May Hart discovered, was much like that mud. It was heavy, it was messy, and it required a slog to get through. Harlan Kestrel was not hanged. The world was not so poetic as that. Instead, his lawyers arrived from Denver and Chicago, men in pinstriped suits who spoke of jurisdiction and technicalities. They delayed the hearings for 3 months. They filed motions to dismiss the evidence of the Shackles, claiming they were medical restraints for the insane. They threatened Elias Thorne, the journalist, with libel suits that would bankrupt his grandchildren. But the town had changed. The silence that Kestrel had purchased for so long had been broken. And once a thing is broken, it cannot be made whole again in quite the same way. Arthur Vance, the land agent, proved to be a terrier with a bone. He bypassed the local courts and took the fraud charges to the territorial level. He froze Kestrel's assets. The mine could not pay its guards. And when the money stopped, loyalty evaporated like morning mist. The guards drifted away, leaving the gates open and the watchtowers empty. For Eliza, the victory was not in the courtroom speeches, which she found exhausting and hollow. The victory was in the quiet, desperate work that began at the San Cristobal mission. They called it the Heart Refuge, though Eliza hated the name. She preferred to call it simply the house. It was a renovated barn on the mission grounds, the roof patched by Jonah and Thomas, the walls whitewashed by the women they had freed. It was not a place of immediate joy. It was a place of purging. The 40 workers brought down from the mountain were broken people. They coughed up coal dust. They woke screaming in the night, clawing at ankles that were no longer bound. They hoarded bread under their pillows because they could not believe breakfast would come in the morning. Eliza was there every day. She did not act the part of the Lady Bountiful. She scrubbed floors. She boiled sheets. She sat by the beds of women who could not speak and simply held their hands until their trembling stopped. Jonah watched her. He spent his days working with Thomas at the forge or repairing the joists of the barn, but his eyes were always on her. He saw the way she moved, efficient, driven, but with a fragility she tried to hide. He struggled with the town. Silverton was too loud, too full of people who wanted to shake his hand or buy him a drink. He was a man of the high timber. The smell of perfume and coal smoke made his head ache. He felt the walls of civilization closing in, and the old urge to saddle his horse and disappear into the tree line was a constant, itching heat under his skin. One evening in late March, Jonah was chopping wood behind the mission kitchen. The rhythm of the axe was soothing. Thwack, crack, thwack, crack. Eliza came out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the damp chill. She watched him for a moment. "You are unhappy," she said. It was not a question. Jonah rested the axe head on the chopping block. He wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm. "I am not cut out for settlements. Eliza, I do not like the way men look at me, like I am a hero. I am not a hero. I just did what needed doing." Eliza walked over to him. She picked up a piece of split pine and smelled the resin. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but Jonah heard the terrified catch in it. She was giving him an out. She knew who he was. Jonah looked at the mountains, purple and jagged against the twilight sky. He looked at the trail that led north, toward the solitude he had cherished for 5 years. Then he looked at Eliza. He saw the dark smudges under her eyes. He saw the strength in her jaw and the scar on her wrist. "I want to leave," Jonah admitted. "I want to be where the air is clean and the only law is the weather." Eliza nodded, looking down at the wood in her hands. "I understand, but," Jonah continued, his voice dropping to a low rumble, "I find that the mountains are empty now. If I went back, if I sat by a fire alone, I would not be at peace. I would be wondering if you were warm. I would be wondering if you were safe." He stepped closer, taking the wood from her hands and dropping it to the ground. He took her hands in his. "I do not stay because I am saved. Eliza, I am not a tame dog, but I have found a fight that is worth more than the quiet, and I have found a woman who makes the noise bearable." Eliza looked up at him, tears swimming in her eyes. "I do not want to tame you. Jonah Blackwood, I just want to walk beside you. Then I am staying," he said. The spring brought the trials to a close. Harlan Kestrel was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. It was not a hanging, but for a man like Kestrel, stripping him of his name and his power was a death of its own. With the legal battles fading, the reality of their relationship began to take root. It was one thing to fall in love while running from bullets. It was another to love while deciding whose turn it was to fetch water or patch the roof. They rented a small room above the livery stable while they looked for land. It was a humble space, smelling of hay and leather, but it was theirs. Their romance matured in the quiet moments. It was found in the way Jonah would sharpen Eliza's kitchen knife without being asked, testing the edge with his thumb until it was perfect. It was found in the way Eliza would read to him in the evenings from the newspapers Elias Thorne brought them, her voice soft and rhythmic, smoothing away the tension in Jonah's shoulders. They laughed, too, a quiet, dry humor that surprised them both. One morning, Jonah was trying to fix a broken coffee grinder, cursing softly as the tiny gears scattered across the table. Eliza watched him, sipping from her cup. "You can track a cougar across bare rock," she noted, "but a coffee grinder defeats you." Jonah glared at the pile of parts. "The cougar makes sense. The cougar does not have springs that jump across the room for no reason." Eliza laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent, less brittle. "Leave it, mountain man. I will fix it. You go catch us a trout." But the trauma was still there, lurking like a submerged stone in a river. It happened on a Tuesday. Eliza was walking past the blacksmith shop. Thomas was hammering a glowing horseshoe. He missed a strike, and the hammer hit the anvil with a chaotic, ringing clang that sounded exactly like a cell door slamming. Eliza froze. The street dissolved. She was back in the dark. She couldn't breathe. Her hands flew to her throat, clawing at the collar of her dress. She stumbled back. collapsing against a rain barrel, gasping for air. Jonah was down the street, talking to Arthur Vance. He saw her fall. He did not run in a panic. He moved with purpose. He reached her just as a crowd was beginning to form. "Give her room," Jonah barked, his voice scattering the onlookers like a shotgun blast. He knelt in the dirt beside her. He did not grab her. He knew that touch, in that moment, could feel like an attack. "Eliza," he said, his voice calm and grounding. "Look at the mud on my boots." Eliza was hyperventilating, her eyes rolling back. "Eliza," Jonah repeated. "Look at the mud. It is red mud, San Juan mud. You are on Main Street." He waited. He blocked the sun so she could see him clearly. "Tell me what you see," he commanded gently. Eliza gasped, focusing on his face. I see your scar." "Good. What else?" "I see your blue shirt." "Good. You are here. You are with me. No one has a key to you." Slowly, the panic receded, leaving her shaking and exhausted. She reached out, and then he took her hand, pulling her up. "I hate it," she whispered fiercely, wiping her eyes. "I hate that I am still broken." "You are not broken," Jonah said, supporting her weight. "You are healing. A broken bone aches when the rain comes. The mind is no different. We just wait for the storm to pass." By summer, the articles written by Elias Thorne had reached the East Coast. Harper's Weekly ran a feature titled "The Chains of the San Juans." It sparked outrage in parlors from Boston to Richmond. The government was forced to launch a wider inquiry into mining practices across the territories. The Kestrel Ridge case became a precedent. Arthur Vance came to the refuge one afternoon in July. He carried a document. The mining company is in receivership. Vance told Eliza and Jonah, "The federal government has ordered the liquidation of assets to pay restitution to the victims. Every worker on your list will receive $200. It was a fortune for people who had nothing. It was a new life." "And the camp?" Eliza asked. "Abandoned," Vance said. "The machinery is being sold for scrap. The buildings are to be razed." Eliza looked at Jonah. "I need to go back," she said. Jonah did not ask why. He simply went to saddle the horses. The ride up to Kestrel Ridge was strange. The road, once terrifying, was just a road. The wildflowers were blooming, columbine and Indian paintbrush rioting in colors of purple and red. When they reached the gates, they were open, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. The guard towers were empty, staring blindly out at the valley. The silence was absolute. There was no roar of crushers, no shouting of foremen, no clanking of chains. Eliza dismounted and walked into the compound. Weeds were already pushing up through the packed earth of the yard. She walked past the whipping post, which was leaning to one side. She walked to the women's barracks. The door was open. She stepped inside. It smelled of dust and old wood. The bunks were empty frames. Light filtered through the cracks in the walls. Eliza walked to the bunk in the far corner. Her bunk. She saw the scratch marks on the wood where she had counted the days. She stood there for a long time. She was waiting for the ghost of the girl she had been to scream. But there was no scream. There was only the wind whistling through the eaves. She walked out of the barracks and went to the supply shed. The door had been torn off. Inside, the floor was littered with debris. In the corner, half buried in a drift of blown leaves, lay a pile of iron. Shackles. Jonah stood in the doorway, watching her. He did not interfere. This was her reckoning. Eliza knelt. She reached out and placed her palm flat against the cold, rusted metal. It felt dead. It had no power. It was just iron, metal dug from the earth, shaped by men, and discarded by time. "You took 2 years of my life," she whispered to the iron. "But you did not take me." She stood up, wiping the rust from her hand onto her skirt. She turned to Jonah. "Burn it," she said. Jonah raised an eyebrow. "The shed. All of it," Eliza said. "The barracks, the shed, the post. Burn it all down." Jonah nodded. He gathered dry brush and old timber. He worked with a grim satisfaction. He soaked the wood in the remaining coal oil from the lantern stores. When he lit the match, the flame caught instantly. The dry wood, seasoned by years of misery, burned hot and fast. They stood together on the ridgeline, watching the fire consume the camp. The smoke rose in a black column, staining the perfect blue sky. The heat was intense, forcing them to step back. Eliza leaned back against Jonah's chest. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "It is gone," Jonah said. Eliza watched the roof of the barracks collapse in a shower of sparks. "No," she said, "it is not gone. It will always be part of who I am. But it is ash now, and I can walk through ash." That night, they camped near the tree line, miles away from the smoldering ruins. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and sage. They lay on their bedroll under the vast canopy of stars. The Milky Way was a river of crushed diamonds overhead. Eliza turned to Jonah. She ran her hand down the length of his arm, feeling the muscle and the scars. She traced the line of his jaw. "Jonah," she whispered. He looked at her, his eyes dark and full of a tenderness that still stole her breath. "I want you," she said. "Not because I am lonely, not because I am cold. I want you because you are Jonah." She kissed him, and the kiss was different than before. It was not desperate. It was deep, slow, and deliberate. It was the claiming of a future. When he moved over her, there was no hesitation. The act was a celebration of autonomy. Every touch was a choice. Every gasp was a testament to the fact that they were alive, that their bodies were capable of pleasure as well as pain. Jonah worshipped her with his hands and his mouth. He memorized the map of her skin, and Eliza met him with a fierce, joyful intensity. Her legs wrapping around him, strong, steady, and free. In the aftermath, lying tangled together in the cooling air, Jonah kissed the scars on her ankles. "We will find a place," he murmured against her skin. "I already have," Eliza said. "They found the land in late August." It was a valley tucked between two shoulders of the mountains, watered by a creek that ran clear and cold. It was wild country, hard to reach, where the snow would be deep in winter and the elk would come down in the autumn. It was not an easy life they chose. They built the cabin themselves, felling the trees and notching the logs. They planted a garden that fought the frost. They raised horses, sturdy, mountain-bred animals that could handle the terrain. They did not become wealthy. They did not become famous, though the story of the girl in the iron shackles was told in taverns for a generation. They became something better. They became constant. 5 years later, on a crisp morning in October, Eliza stood on the porch of the cabin. She was holding a child, a boy with Jonah's gray eyes and her dark hair. She watched a rider coming down the slope. It was Jonah, returning from checking the trap lines. He rode easy in the saddle, a man at home in his world. He saw her and waved. Eliza looked out at the valley. She saw the smoke rising from their chimney. She saw the horses grazing in the paddock. She saw the mountains, indifferent and eternal, rising behind them. She looked down at her ankles. The scars were still there, silver bands of tissue that would never tan. She did not hide them anymore. She wore them like medals. Jonah rode up to the porch and swung down. He walked up the steps, dusting the snow from his coat. He took the boy from her arms and kissed the child's forehead, then leaned in to kiss Eliza. His beard was cold, but his lips were warm. "Everything all right?" he asked. Eliza looked at him. She thought of the creek where he had found her. She thought of the fire where she had burned the camp. She thought of the long, hard road that had led them to this porch. "My legs," she said, smiling at him with a fierce, enduring love. Jonah smiled back, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. "They are steady." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder, looking out at the wild, honest land that held them. "They are steady," she said, "and we are home. Thank you, dear reader, for journeying with me through the high passes and dark valleys of this story. Jonah and Eliza's tale is one of resilience, and it has been my honor to craft it for you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did the ending resonate with you? If you enjoyed this tale of the American frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of love, survival, and the grit of the old days. Until next time, Keep your powder dry and your heart true.